The streets of Dodge City were built on a soundstage in Los Angeles. The Long Branch Saloon had a false front. The Kansas prairie in the background was painted. None of it was real, and none of that mattered to the 30 million people who watched it every week. For 20 seasons on CBS, from September 10, 1955 to March 31, 1975, 635 episodes, Gunsmoke was the longest-running dramatic series in the history of American network television, a record it held until Law & Order tied it in 2010. It began as a serious, adult-oriented Western at a time when the genre was dominated by children's fare, and it stayed serious for 2 decades while the world outside changed entirely around it. Today, of the principal cast that made Dodge City famous, only one is still alive. Their stories deserve to be told in full. Number 1 is James Arness, who played Marshal Matt Dillon for all 20 seasons and all 635 episodes, and who held the longest continuous dramatic lead tenure in American television history until Kelsey Grammer matched it. He was born James King Arness on May 26, 1923, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the son of a traveling salesman and a newspaper columnist. His younger brother Peter Arness would later change his name to Peter Graves and become the star of Mission Impossible. The two brothers grew up together in Minneapolis in what Arness described as a real Huckleberry Finn existence: free, physical, outdoor. Arness entered Beloit College in Wisconsin in the fall of 1942 and was drafted into the Army before his freshman year was finished. He arrived at Anzio Beachhead on January 22, 1944, as a rifleman with the 7th Infantry Regiment of the 3rd Infantry Division. He was 6 feet 7 inches tall, the tallest man in his unit, and was ordered off the landing craft first to gauge the water depth. What happened next changed the trajectory of his body for the rest of his life. A German machine gun position opened fire before the beach was secured and shattered his right leg. He was evacuated through a chain of hospitals in Italy, Iowa, and Colorado, and spent the remainder of the year in recovery. His right leg never fully healed. When he walked onto a Gunsmoke soundstage 20 years later and did it again for 635 episodes, he hid the limp with careful blocking and a particular long stride. Most viewers never noticed. The men and women who worked with him knew. The limp that characterized Matt Dillon was not invented for the camera. It was carried in from Anzio. He came to Hollywood in 1946 on a friend's suggestion. He was initially resistant to the idea. His height, 6 feet 7 inches, made him an unlikely leading man by the standards of the early 1950s studio system, which preferred its heroes compact and camera-friendly. John Wayne, who was himself 6 feet 4, used Arness as a supporting player in several pictures and became convinced that his friend's size, properly used, was an asset. When CBS approached Wayne about playing Matt Dillon in the television adaptation of the Gunsmoke radio series, Wayne turned them down and told them to call his friend Jim. They did. Arness initially turned the role down as well, afraid of being typecast in a medium that most Hollywood professionals still regarded as beneath the feature film world. Wayne eventually persuaded him. Arness shook hands on the deal. He dyed his naturally blonde hair darker for the role. He wore the badge for 20 years. What most viewers never knew is the private grief running underneath those 20 seasons. His first wife, Virginia, had serious emotional difficulties and attempted suicide twice, in 1959 and again in 1960. Their daughter Jenny, born in 1950, struggled with addiction. In 1975, in the same year Gunsmoke ended its run, Jenny Arness died of what was described as an apparently deliberate drug overdose. She was 24 years old. 2 years later, in 1977, Virginia Arness died of an overdose that police ruled accidental. Arness never spoke publicly about either loss in detail. He gave almost no interviews about his private life throughout his career and maintained that privacy with a consistency that the people who knew him understood as grief, not coldness. He married Janet Surtees in 1978 and spent his later years in Brentwood, California, with a privacy he had earned and refused to surrender. He died in his sleep at his Brentwood home on June 3, 2011. He was 88 years old. His business manager, Ginny Fazer, confirmed the death. A private memorial service was held per his instructions. He is interred at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, in the Great Mausoleum, Sanctuary of Abiding Hope, Crypt 1617-4. The man who walked into Dodge City in 1955 on a wounded leg he never let anyone see, spent 56 years making sure nobody looked too closely at the things that hurt him. He is in Glendale now, in the hills above the city, where he made his name and lost his family, and kept working anyway. Number 2 is Milburn Stone, who played Dr. Galen Doc Adams for all 20 seasons and all 635 episodes, missing only 7 across 2 decades, a statistic of professional commitment that deserves its own moment of silence, and who came to the role at the age of 51 after a career so long and so unrewarded that most men in his position would have stopped expecting things to change. He was born on July 5, 1904, in Burton, Kansas, the son of a family with deep roots in the state. He turned down a congressional appointment to the United States Naval Academy at 18 to join a traveling repertory company instead, a choice that tells you something about who he was. He worked vaudeville as half of a comedy song and dance act called Stone and Strain. He did a turn on Broadway in 1934. He arrived in Hollywood in 1935 and spent the next 20 years appearing in uncredited bit parts in over 150 films. Bits as police officers, doctors, judges, court clerks, bank robbers, sailors, reporters. 2 decades of work that nobody would remember. Doc Adams was the conscience of Dodge City, the country doctor who never turned a patient away, who kept his whiskey bottle in his desk drawer and his medical bag perpetually packed, whose sharp tongue was the show's most reliable early warning system for danger, and whose soft heart was the show's most reliable evidence that decency was still possible in a place organized around violence. Stone took the role with a seriousness that made the character's medical authenticity credible across 20 seasons. He was famously protective of the show's quality, and those who worked with him recalled him storming off a soundstage after a dispute with a young producer, reportedly announcing that he was too old to scare and too rich to care. He won the Emmy for Outstanding Supporting Actor in 1968. In 1961, like Amanda Blake, he sold his residual rights to CBS for a flat $100,000, a sum that seemed reasonable at the time and that he regretted for the remainder of his life as the show ran in syndication for decades. After Gunsmoke ended in 1975, Stone retired to a ranch near Rancho Santa Fe in San Diego, where he fished and built furniture for the house, and largely refused to look back at the industry. He died of heart failure at Scripps Memorial Hospital in La Jolla on June 12, 1980. He was 75. He is interred at El Camino Memorial Park in San Diego, California, in the city where he had spent his retirement, near the water he loved, in the state where the show had been filmed, but nowhere near the soundstage where Doc Adams had earned his living. The man who spent 20 years appearing in bit parts that nobody remembered spent the next 20 years being remembered by 30 million people every week. He spent his retirement building furniture and fishing, which was probably the right response. Number 3 is Amanda Blake, who played Kitty Russell, the proprietress of the Long Branch Saloon, the woman who held the room and never asked anyone's permission to do so, and whose unspoken relationship with Matt Dillon constituted one of the great unfinished love stories in American television, and whose final years carried a truth the public was not given until after she was gone. She was born Beverly Louise Neal on February 20, 1929, in Buffalo, New York, the only child of a banker. She was working as a telephone operator in Claremont, California, when MGM signed her in the late 1940s and tried to package her as the next Greer Garson. The studio gave up on that comparison and eventually let her go. She was 26 when the Gunsmoke producers cast her as the red-headed saloon owner, who would become one of the most quietly powerful women on American television. Miss Kitty ran a room full of armed men without ever once asking permission. She kept her books, managed her staff, dealt with trouble before it became Matt Dillon's problem, and looked at the marshal when he walked through the door with an expression that contained 19 seasons of a love story the writers were never quite willing to name. Blake carried all of it. The warmth, the authority, the unspoken feeling. None of it was in the dialogue. All of it was in the way she played the scenes. She was nominated for no Emmy Awards in 19 seasons. That is perhaps the most damning indictment of the television academy in the history of the Western genre. In 1961, she sold her residual rights to CBS for a flat $100,000. The same decision Milburn Stone made the same year, for the same amount, that both of them would spend years regretting. After leaving Gunsmoke in 1974, exhausted by the commute from her Phoenix ranch and at odds with the show's production team, she devoted most of her remaining years to animals. She and her fourth husband Frank Gilbert had operated a program on their Phoenix ranch to breed cheetahs in captivity, one of the first such programs in the world, eventually raising 7 generations. She co-founded the Performing Animal Welfare Society and worked toward no-kill shelters in Arizona. Her 5th marriage to Austin City Councilman Mark Edward Spoth in 1984 1974 ended 10 months later when Spoth died of AIDS-related pneumonia in 1985. What most viewers never knew until after her death is the cause of it. Amanda Blake died on August 16, 1989, at Mercy General Hospital in Sacramento. She was 60 years old. Her initial death certificate listed oral cancer. She had survived an actual oral cancer diagnosis years earlier. Her physician subsequently disclosed that the cause was AIDS-related complications contracted from a previous partner. The family had requested that the specific cause remain private, and the initial reporting honored that request. The New York Times and other outlets later reported the full cause of death. She is not buried. Per her instructions, ABC News wildlife correspondent Roger Karras carried her ashes to a game preserve in Kenya and scattered them there. A cenotaph carrying her birth name stands at Elmwood Cemetery in Birmingham, Alabama, the city where she attended high school. Miss Kitty held the room for 19 seasons. Amanda Blake asked to be carried to Africa when it was over. If these stories mean something to you, please subscribe. Every detail in this script was verified from primary sources. Your subscription keeps this channel alive for the next story. Number 4 is Dennis Weaver, who played Chester B. Good, the limping, slow-talking deputy who hovered at Matt Dillon's shoulder with a loyalty so complete it read on screen as devotion, and who made the entire character out of a single physical choice made in his audition and was stuck with for 9 seasons. He was born on June 4, 1924 in Joplin, Missouri. He served as a United States Navy pilot in the Second World War, came home to graduate from the University of Oklahoma with a degree in fine arts, and in 1948 competed in the Olympic decathlon trials for the London Games, finishing among the alternates. An actor studio graduate trained by Lee Strasberg, who had competed for an Olympic berth in 1948, was delivering flowers for $60 a week when CBS offered him $300 to play Chester. He took it. The limp was his own invention. He walked into the audition with it because he thought the character needed a defining physical gesture, and once he had done it successfully, he could not undo it. Starting a campfire with a stiff leg in a western Kansas winter, he later said, was considerably harder than it looked. What most viewers never knew is how deliberately Weaver managed his departure from the show. He left in 1964 at the end of the 9th season, not because the role had dried up, but because he was afraid it was going to swallow him permanently. He wanted to be an actor, not a character. Chester Good was becoming the character, and Dennis Weaver wanted more than one. What followed his departure vindicated the decision completely. He starred in McCloud on NBC from 1970 to 1977. He delivered a career-defining performance in Steven Spielberg's first feature film, the 1971 television movie Duel, playing a traveling salesman stalked by an unseen trucker on a California desert highway, a performance of sustained, escalating terror that remains one of the finest in American television film history. From 1973 to 1975, he served as president of the Screen Actors Guild. He married his childhood sweetheart Jerry Stell in 1945 and stayed married to her for 61 years until his last mourning. In 1993, the couple moved into a 10,000 square foot solar-powered house in Ridgway, Colorado, built from recycled tires and 300,000 aluminum cans, which they called River Sage. He was, in his later years, one of the most publicly committed environmental advocates in American entertainment, speaking about sustainability and solar power at a time when those positions were considered eccentric rather than mainstream. Dennis Weaver died at home of cancer complications on February 24, 2006, at age 81. He was cremated and his ashes were given to his family. A 60-acre wildlife reserve named Dennis Weaver Memorial Park sits along the Uncompahgre River corridor in Ridgway, Colorado, dedicated to his memory. Chester Good walked with a limp for 9 seasons. Dennis Weaver was the Olympic decathlon alternate who built his last house out of garbage and earned it. Number 5 is Ken Curtis, who played Festus Hagen, the semi-literate, mountain-talking, mule-riding deputy who arrived in Dodge City in 1964 and stayed for the remaining 11 seasons, and who concealed the most interesting biographical detail on the entire call sheet. Behind a raspy character accent, he applied to himself every morning for a decade. He was born Curtis Wayne Gates on July 2, 1916 in Lamar, Colorado. His father was the sheriff of Bent County, and Ken grew up in the apartment above the town jail, where his mother cooked meals for the prisoners. He attended Colorado College on a pre-med track, dropped out in 1938 to sing, was hired by NBC Radio as a tenor, and in 1941 joined the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra as the band's vocalist, taking the chair Frank Sinatra had recently vacated. When Sinatra left the Dorsey band, Ken Curtis sat down in his seat. That sentence belongs in a different story than the one most people associate with him, and it is true. Army service in Italy from 1943 to 1945 came next. In 1952, he married Barbara Ford, the only daughter of director John Ford, and the marriage earned him supporting roles in some of Ford's most significant films: The Quiet Man, The Searchers, The Wings of Eagles, and The Alamo. He and Barbara divorced in 1964. Festus Hagen debuted on Gunsmoke in 1962 and joined the regular cast in 1964. Curtis based the character on a real man from his childhood, a fence post cutter named Cedar Jack, who used to end up drunk in his father's jail. The voice was entirely invented. His actual singing voice was a clear, smooth tenor. The Festus rasp was a construction he rebuilt from scratch every morning. Ken Curtis died in his sleep of a heart attack at his home in Fresno, California, on April 28, 1991, at age 74. He had attended a rodeo the night before in apparent good health. His wife, Tori, whom he had married in 1966, found him when she woke. He was cremated quickly, and his ashes were scattered across the Colorado flatlands of his childhood near Las Animas. A bronze statue of him as Festus stands at 430 Pulaski Avenue in Clovis, California. Festus Hagen could not read a newspaper. Ken Curtis was the trained tenor who took Frank Sinatra's seat in the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra and married John Ford's only daughter, and made sure nobody on television knew any of it. Number 6 is Buck Taylor, who played Newly O'Brien, the young gunsmith who became Matt Dillon's deputy in the show's 13th season and stayed through the final episode, and who is alive in 2026 at 87 years old, the last principal cast member standing. He was born Walter Clarence Taylor III on May 13, 1938, in Hollywood, California, the son of character actor Dub Taylor. He was a competitive gymnast, seriously enough to be sponsored to the 1960 United States Olympic trials in Rome by actor Gin Big Boy Williams. He failed to qualify for the team. He studied theater at USC and watercolor painting at the Chouinard Art Institute. He served 2 years in the United States Navy before turning to acting full-time. Milburn Stone and Ken Curtis, he has said often, took him aside in his first weeks on the Gunsmoke set and gave him the advice that shaped his professional life: respect the audience and never refuse a fan a moment of your time. He has lived by both for nearly 60 years. 2 of his sons carry the names of his Gunsmoke co-stars: Matthew for James Arness and Cooper Glenn for Glenn Strange. He delivered the eulogy at James Arness's funeral in June 2011. He has appeared in Tombstone, Gettysburg, Cowboys and Aliens, and Hell or High Water. His recurring role on Yellowstone as rancher Emmett Walsh, which ran from 2018 to 2022, introduced him to a generation that had grown up long after Gunsmoke ended and who discovered the show through him. He lives on a ranch near Fort Worth, Texas, with his second wife, creating the annual poster for the Fort Worth Stock Show and Rodeo, painting watercolors of the American West, and keeping a promise he made to 2 dying men on a soundstage in 1967. They ended up in a Glendale mausoleum, in a San Diego cemetery, in Kenya, in Colorado River Silt, on a Fresno flatland morning, and in a Fort Worth painting studio. James Arness is in the Great Mausoleum at Forest Lawn, Crypt 1674, the man who hid a war wound for 20 years and a family tragedy for the rest of his life. Milburn Stone is in El Camino Memorial Park in San Diego, near the ranch where he fished and built furniture and finally rested. Amanda Blake's ashes are in Africa, at the game preserve where the wild cats she spent her last years protecting still walk. Dennis Weaver was given to his family and lives in the memory of the Colorado River corridor. Ken Curtis is in the Colorado Flatlands where he grew up, in the county where his father was sheriff, and Cedar Jack slept off his whiskey in the jail above. And one of them is still here. Buck Taylor at 87, on a ranch near Fort Worth, painting the country his co-stars rode through in front of a camera 50 years ago, and still showing up for the fans because 2 men told him to, and he never stopped believing they were right. The streets of Dodge City were never real. The people who walked them were, and the one who is left is still walking. If these stories meant something to you, leave a comment below. Tell me which one hit hardest. I read every reply.